Dear distinguished speakers and esteemed audience, wherever you are, I hope you are well. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the Impact Live, creating a vibrant global hydrogen economy. My name is Molly Huang, Head of Content of Leader Associates, and your host for today's session. Countries around the globe are putting their legislative weight behind hydrogen as a carbon-free alternative to the fossil fuel energy generation. Hydrogen projects are mushrooming everywhere. According to the IEA database, there are more than 1,400 low-carbon hydrogen projects currently operating or in development worldwide. But to get to the net zero, what needs to happen for hydrogen to fulfill its full potential and to decarbonize or even energize the economic sectors? In today's webinar, we will bring together a high-level discussion on the current status and future prospects. A brief outlook of today's agenda. It will firstly be commenced by Ms. Gauri Singh, Deputy Director General of IRENA, to provide an overview of the topic. Insights from the public representatives from the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States will then follow as the world's main economic entities. We will also explore the dynamics in emerging hydrogen markets, including Brazil, Panama, and Chile, as rising stars of the year. Furthermore, a specific dialogue on the potential of a global hydrogen trading market will be incorporated among supplier, financier, off-taker, industry association, and moderated by the IPHE. With this amazing speaker lineup, I'd like to encourage our audience to actively participate in the Q&A session today, as all the insights here are dedicated to you. I'm also excited to announce that today's virtual session is the global launch of our physical event, Investing in Green Hydrogen 2023, scheduled to take place in London of UK on this September the 14th to 15th. Uniting over 1,500 hydrogen investors, project developers, financiers, and supply chain innovators. The IGH 2023 is your unmissable gateway to engage with the global hydrogen ecosystem. We humbly invite you to the journey and look forward to meeting you in person. And that's everything about us. As today we have a quite compact agenda, without further ado, let's get started by inviting our opening speaker on stage, Ms. Gauri Singh, Deputy Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. Ms. Singh, I give the floor to you.
Okay, so thank you so much, and let me start with saying that this decade has actually started with a lot of turmoil, and we are now seeing economies where there are polycrises that face them. But the good thing is that we still see a very strong showing on the intent, the political intent, and the private sector coming together for ramping up the deployment of clean energies. And definitely hydrogen is something that's really exciting people, investors all across the globe. So if I can just have the first slide. So let me start by saying that at IRENA we feel that by 2050 electricity will be the main carrier with more than 50% share in the total final energy consumption, which is moving up from the 21% that it is currently. Also, we think that 90% of this will come from renewables, and if I look at the technology pathways that are critical for reducing the emission, it will definitely be renewables, energy efficiency, and higher share of electrification as we go along. Hydrogen, as you can see, has emerged as a key player and will play a very important role in the energy transition. And we do think that about 12% is what we will see in the total final energy mix by 2050, of which 2/3 will come from green hydrogen. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is just to give you a snapshot of where the hydrogen solutions will be the most effective, and what kind of priorities the countries are also putting. Definitely steel making, industrial processes that require high temperatures, and chemicals and refineries. These are definitely some of the sectors where hydrogen will play a very major part, as these are really the more difficult to abate sectors. The next slide, please. So, this, I mean, it's the current scenario is nearly all of the hydrogen that's getting produced is gray hydrogen. And this is just to say that the quantum that would be needed as we move forward in the 2030s and 2050s will involve a very major ramp up in terms of scale. Right now, we're looking at less than 1 gigawatt of installed electrolyzer capacity. And what I also wanted to show in this slide is how how the estimates for the role that green hydrogen will play, and hydrogen will play in the energy transition. There's a lot of convergence of views that is happening. We do, of course, have BNF, which has got a more is showing at a more aggressive amount of about 22%. The next slide, please. This is really to say that we are, while we're looking at green hydrogen, we also need to keep in mind that the electricity demand will go up nearly 3 times. And the amount of electricity that's being consumed currently globally is what would be needed to run the processes which will involve nearly 4,400 gigawatts of electrolyzers. So it's a huge ramp up in terms of where we need to go with the electrification, but also to understand that hydrogen is going to be a very major consumer of the renewable power as we move ahead from 2030 to 2050. The next, please. So, here the important point I'd like to focus on is that, currently, as I mentioned, more than 100 million tons of hydrogen is being manufactured globally, but mostly in being used in fertilizers and oil refining, plus downstream chemicals. So right now, it's actually a major source of emission. So it's not a decarbonization vector. And almost all of this hydrogen is produced, as I mentioned, from fossil fuels. So we need to scale today's production 6-fold, and making sure that the majority of the hydrogen that gets produced is green. And just to give you a sense of scale, again, to reiterate, just for the production of hydrogen and derivatives, we will roughly need as much electricity as the world consumes today, nearly 21,000 terawatt hours. So it's a huge ramp up that we are really envisaging. The next slide, please. With IRENA's analysis, we think that a combination of 4 strategies are critical for getting the cost of electrolyzer down. So, green hydrogen, as you know, is produced through electrolysis process of electricity and water being the main inputs. And the critical factors to determine the cost are the cost of electricity, capital cost of the electrolyzer and operational load factors. But clearly, innovation to reduce the cost and improve the performance of the electrolyzer is going to be very critical. Technologies that either don't have rare materials or have a very minimal amount will be very important for the scale up that's needed from to the multi-gigawatt level that we want to reach. Economies of scale by increasing the size of the module and reducing the cost contribution from the balance of plant and auxiliary equipment is also very important. So, cost is not the only driver for module size, because the specific application also has a role to play in this. Economies of scale can also, of course, be achieved by during the manufacturing of stacks. And if one achieves the scale of around 1 gigawatt a year, that could already, start leading to a semi-automation of the manufacturing processes, leading to reduction in fixed cost per unit. Definitely standardization of design, optimizing of supply chains, replicating of the installation, learning from best practices, all this will also be very, very important in getting the cost down. The next slide, please. So this again, I mean, it's something just to show how the costs have dramatically come down. We are really moving into a world of abundant and cheap renewables. Cost of solar PV has declined by 85% over the last decade. Wind offshore has declined by 60%. Wind offshore by 50%. And in many geographies, solar and wind are the cheapest option to produce power. So it's becoming, cheaper to build a new solar plant than to even continue operating existing plants. Next slide, please. So this is a slide with the countries that have strategies for low carbon hydrogen. Last year, of course, saw the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act in August by the US, which has which has a very strong hydrogen component in it and incentives for hydrogen production, along with the other clean energy and low carbon technologies. And India also announced its hydrogen mission to move forward on a pathway of getting hydrogen into the energy mix. So with these two other large economies coming into the fray, I think it's a very interesting field that has been set in play, and it's very exciting to watch how the turn of events will shape. The next, please. The next slide, please. So this is just to give a snapshot of where most of the projects are coming. And clearly, as you can see, the large-scale industrial usage projects are many more, followed by transport. And this seems to be the trend moving forward in terms of investments and projects coming globally. Next, please. So in the hydrogen trade, we expect that just about 25 to 30% will get internationally traded, and half of it through pipelines and the remaining through shipping. And this basically means that a lot which will get produced will be consumed domestically to become a critical part in the energy transition strategies of that economy. The next slide, please. Again, this is just to give some sense of what kind of international cooperation is happening in the hydrogen sector. And these are all that will allow the hydrogen ecosystem to grow. It's only with a long-term demand visibility that investments will happen in hydrogen. And these bilateral trade agreements and MOUs are pretty much leading way for that visibility to come through for the investors in the countries that would export to the countries that are now looking to import green hydrogen. Next slide, please. So this is what we think at IRENA is going to be the way that the countries that who are already in the which have very strong strategies in play. We think that this is how it'll move to 2030, and as green hydrogen becomes competitive moving forward. Next slide, please. So I just want to end with some of the very key issues that we need to keep in mind. Definitely, hydrogen is one very critical piece in the energy transition strategy, and it cannot be just seen in isolation. It has to be seen as a larger part of the energy transition that's happening economy-wide. It's also going to change the way the international cooperation happens, because it's not something that it's not the international cooperation as business as usual. It'll really if it moves in the way that we've seen some early MOUs and agreements happening, it can actually lead to a very collaborative way for developing and developed countries to work together on building this ecosystem for hydrogen forward. Also, it's I think some of the strategies, we also feel that not enough emphasis has been placed on the demand side. A lot of emphasis has been placed on the supply side. And unless there's a very strong emphasis on the offtake, and there is a clear visibility for what the long-term market looks like, the rate at which investments will flow in this sector will not be to the extent that it can happen if there's clear visibility. Can we just move to the next slide? So I just want to leave you with some of the publications that we've done at IRENA, which pretty much look at all aspects of the value chain, right from the supply, the trade, the technologies, and policies. I would encourage you to go to our website and have a look at these. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Singh, for helping us set the stage and outline IRENA's outlook towards a future global hydrogen economy. I would also like to give a brief background of today's event. Today's virtual session is the global launch of our physical event, Investing in Green Hydrogen 2023, scheduled to take place in London of UK on September the 14th to 15th, uniting over 1,500 hydrogen investors, project developers, financiers, and supply chain partners. This IGH 2023 is your unmissable gateway to engage with the global hydrogen ecosystem. We humbly invite you to join. And to Ms. Gauri Singh, prior to the live day, we have also collected several questions from the audience. If I may, there are 2 questions on the top of our minds. Ms. Gauri Singh, can you hear me good?
I can, Molly.
Yes. So the first question is, what is the biggest challenge you see facing widespread adoption of hydrogen? You mentioned the production part, but what about the adoption part?
So, I think I really want to reiterate that I think the focus is much more on the supply side of hydrogen generation. And if we don't have a very strong visibility on how it gets, what kind of off-taker agreements will be there, long-term off-taker agreements, these projects will remain very risky, and investment won't flow it. And I think this is also an opportunity for countries to adopt policies to support both the supply and the demand for green hydrogen. And if countries like, I would say countries like the G7 could actually come together and signal their clear intent through a support and with the prioritization of specific end users to create like a bulk demand for hydrogen, especially in the critical hard to decarbonize sectors, then I think the deployment will really get expedited. Then also standards and certification still remains a challenge. Of course, the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy is developing a methodology for certifying emissions from hydrogen production and from transport, which will be used as an input for developing international standard by the ISO. So this still is a challenge, and it needs to be overcome to get the deployment moving and getting it ramped up.
So let's zooming in the consumer sector, assuming the international standards are aligned soon. Which industry do you think will see earliest adoption of low carbon hydrogen?
So I think a good candidate for this would be the refineries and the fertilizer sector, because these are currently the large scale users of hydrogen. Now, what we need to be mindful of that to be able to adopt to green hydrogen, it will require process re-engineering and process changes. And that naturally will also involve investment. And this investment will only happen if they have a clear indication of where these products with green hydrogen use will get sold. So my take would be refineries and fertilizers would probably be the early adopters.
Thank you. And one last question to wrap up your presentation. It's actually two questions. So how do you see the role of Africa and Asia in the global hydrogen supply chain, especially for China, Japan, India? And also, we notice there are some countries with tiny territories. They seem not having an advantage on this global hydrogen economy. Any strategies to suggest? This question is actually from Korea, so I just raised this to you.
Yeah, so I think as I did show in my slides that there are these very strong bilateral agreements that are coming into place. So you have countries like Namibia with a bilateral agreement to supply green hydrogen to Germany. I believe there's also there are of course agreements that are getting put in place from the MENA region to supply green hydrogen to Europe and also from Nigeria, I believe. So it's very earlier one would have expected that if you had a nexus of renewable energy resources in your country and you wanted to actually be able to export it, there was no other way than to go through the grid lines. Now, with green hydrogen, this is another form of really being able to export low-cost renewable energy-based hydrogen to the other countries. So it can become a very strong lever, a trade lever, and a way for the economies to really benefit from. That's something that we are seeing. And if you're talking about small countries, you have a small country like Chile, which has a very ambitious target of becoming a global leader and exporting hydrogen at, I think it's at about 1.5 USD per kilo. So, there's a lot of excitement with countries that are trying to come on to this bandwagon and play their part in building the hydrogen ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ms. Gauri Singh, for your insightful address and answers. And now let me invite our next keynote speaker on stage, who will introduce more about European hydrogen status and outlook. Please join me to welcome Mr. Ruud Campena, Team Leader, Cabinet of the Commissioner for Energy of European Commission. Please join me to welcome Ruud.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are. Indeed, in the next 15 minutes, I will give a brief presentation on what is happening here within Europe. So what I will do in the next 15 minutes is to give you a brief overview of what is happening here in Europe in terms of creating indeed this hydro ecosystem, what Ms. Gauri Singh also mentioned before. And so what happened here in the EU is that we developed a hydrogen strategy in 2020, but we actually updated and upgraded that in beginning of 2022, in particular because Europe faced it and is still facing an energy crisis. And with that in mind, we believe in particular renewable hydrogen is one of the key enablers to allow Europe to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. We did this by kind of upgrading an existing target, which we had about 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen production within the EU, with an additional 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen imported into the EU to satisfy the demand of off-takers across industry and the transport sector in particular. Secondly, to expedite infrastructure for hydrogen, dedicated hydrogen infrastructure within the EU, as well as stepping up our international engagements in the area of hydrogen. Now, today, or actually this week, is quite a special week here within the European Union, because we've managed, in particular this week, to take some really concrete steps in creating a full regulatory framework for hydrogen within the European Union. And for the international audience here, I think it's very important to understand that such a European framework, a regulatory framework for hydrogen, essentially means that we will have 27 EU member states which have all the same regulatory framework. So that creates huge market opportunities for the development of hydrogen, common rules, common standards, and really the opportunity to also support both cross-border collaboration within the region, but also with international partners. So in this particular slide, I try to identify 5 big blocks of regulatory and policy areas that we have been working over for the last 2 years. Now, for those who are not familiar with how the European Union works, the European Commission often develops proposals for regulation, and then it's up to member states and the European Parliament to agree on those proposals. Now, this week, as I mentioned before, we made some very important steps, and I'll not go through every single point, but just give you a couple of examples which I think are very, very relevant. Now, first of all, on the production side. So what happened this week is that the European Commission has, in February this year, put forward a proposal to specifically define what is renewable hydrogen. I already saw some comments and questions coming through in the chat. Now, this definition includes specific criteria which you as a producer have to adhere to in order to be defined and to be qualified as a renewable hydrogen. This is important, and I'll explain that in a second, because once you're qualified as renewable hydrogen, that also means that your product in itself is recognized and contributes to Europe's targets in terms of renewable energy. So we put these criteria forward after very long consultations with industries and member states, etc., in February this year. And at the beginning of the week, we got a very positive sign from the European Parliament that it looks more and more likely, it is not completed yet, but it looks likely that the European Parliament will be agreeing with these criteria. That is going to be a huge milestone, because that means that any investor, not only in Europe, but around the world, everyone who is interested in starting to import renewable hydrogen to Europe will know exactly how to produce that renewable hydrogen, not only today, but it really provides a framework all the way up to 2050. It is really a kind of a dynamic framework, taking all the different kind of phases of the hydrogen market and development stage into consideration. So a key element happened this week. Now, a second point, and that's also what is mentioned before, is infrastructure. So here again, the European Commission put forward proposals on how we think a future hydrogen infrastructure should be regulated in December 2021. And again, this week, it was only this week that member states actually agreed upon their own position on this proposal. So what we now have on the table is a position and an idea of the member states, how this should be regulated, as well as a position from the European Parliament, which we've had in the past. Now, it's very important and very interesting to see that there are some really clear commonalities in terms of their positions on our proposal. And I think one of the key elements there is that the availability of these pipelines to be accessible to both producers and consumers is going to be really important. So we're going to have in the future pipelines that will be independently operated, and whereby producers and consumers can connect and kind of trade their hydrogen over a hydrogen infrastructure once it gets connected across the EU. At the same time, we also provide regulatory certainty for small hydrogen valleys, which are infrastructure pipelines which connect a small number of producers and consumers in an isolated manner. So with those positions in place, we are confident that definitely before the end of the year, we will also have this regulatory framework for infrastructure in place. This means also for importers, of course, that they know that once they arrive in Europe, there will be terminals available, accessible to them. They will know the tariffs that they will need to pay to store that hydrogen there, and they will know the tariffs that they will need to pay to, for example, send that hydrogen through these pipelines from ports to the end consumers within Europe. Now, another important block of regulation is demand. And I'm very happy that the Deputy Director General of IRENA, Ms. Gauri Singh, really paid attention to this point as well. Because what happened actually this morning, and that's why I look a little bit tired, is that throughout the night, member states, the European Parliament, as well as the European Commission has been negotiating another proposal from us, which is to set obligatory targets for the uptake of renewable hydrogen in industry and transport. And I'm very happy to say that although these agreements will still have to be formally approved, etc., so nothing is completely regulated yet, but the provisional agreements from this morning seem to indicate that we are going to have targets for the uptake of renewable hydrogen in the European industry, as well as uptake of renewable hydrogen in the European transport sector in 2030. So that means that actually from this morning onwards, we really will create visibility about the future market of that hydrogen, and therefore give the opportunities to kind of producers and developers around the world to start gearing up their projects to satisfy that future demand. So very important blocks: production, infrastructure, as well as demand. Now, a week and a half ago, the European Commission also published what is called the European Hydrogen Bank. And that's a piece of policy which is here under the topic of investments, where we want to use and create a European instrument that will already facilitate offtake agreements well ahead of those 2030 targets that we agreed upon this morning. So what will the European Hydrogen Bank do? It will become a facility within the EU, helping producers both within the EU as well as international producers to connect to off-takers. And if those production costs are too high for the European off-takers, so there's a green premium, then those facilities, the instruments, will organize auctions to cover that green premium costs. So our first auction, especially for domestic producers, we are intending to already issue before the end of the year, in autumn this year. So that will be another and very important tool to ramp up the market for renewable hydrogen within the EU. But like I mentioned before, hydrogen is not only to look at how can we get rid of our European dependence on imported fossil fuels. We also see it as a critical tool to engage and kind of accelerate our international partnerships with countries around the world. And in particular, at the end of last year, at COP27, the European Commission signed its first green hydrogen partnerships with countries like Namibia, that was already mentioned before, Kazakhstan, but also Egypt, of course, where the COP27 took place. Recently, we also signed an agreement with Ukraine, which is very important, of course. And here, what is very interesting is that now we have really a partnerships which is looking at Ukraine not becoming a transit country from natural gas anymore, but really becoming a partner for the delivery of renewable gases, biomethane, and renewable hydrogen to the EU. So again, internationally, we're also putting a policy framework forward. So in my title, I wanted to kind of reflect a little bit, okay, why are we doing this? Now, one of the key elements is, of course, climate. Fossil hydrogen production today within Europe is still primarily produced on fossil fuels. And in our regulatory framework, we set like a specific target to reduce the CO2 footprint of that hydrogen that we're consuming. Like I mentioned before, the delegated act sets exactly out what those criteria are, including for the production, for example, of e-fuels, where maybe hydrogen is produced in an electrolyzer, but then afterwards combined with a CO2 molecule to produce e-fuels, for example, for the aviation sector. So having those kind of low thresholds for the CO2 intensity is one of the kind of cornerstones of our hydrogen framework. Important here also to say is that what the European Union has put in place it's a CO2 footprint which is really from the well all the way to the end consumer, including the CO2 associated with bringing that hydrogen from the producer to the end consumer. Now, another important element is the social aspect. Oh, sorry, security first. Another important element is security. Like I mentioned before, we see the use of hydrogen not only to replace the dependence of natural gas from Russia, but we also see that hydrogen can be used to reduce our dependence, for example, of coal, in the steel sector. And this graph shows you where we expect the hydrogen to be taken up within the EU in 2030. So here in orange, you see the volumes, the megatons of hydrogen that we see, for example, going into the steel sector, but also the production as ammonia, also mentioned before, is going to be one of the big consumers, and also high temperature heat in the industrial sector. Synthetic fuels is another element where we think, and that is also through the targets that we established this morning and last week, we think there will be big opportunities there. And then last but not least, the social aspect. One of the key areas why we promote the uptake of renewable hydrogen, not only within the EU, but also within partners, is of course that it requires a lot of investments into the production of additional renewable power generation to make that renewable hydrogen, which is again associated with the creation of a lot of added value, including jobs. As you can see, the majority, for every billion that we're going to invest within the EU, we see 6,600 jobs being created, both directly and indirectly jobs, for example, in the production of additional renewable power for that hydrogen consumption. So with these slides, I hope I gave you a good overview of what is happening in the EU. This week has definitely been a very important week for Europe in the area of hydrogen. And we do believe that with these steps taken this week, we will be well ahead in creating a really comprehensive framework for hydrogen before the end of the year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Campena, for your kind and very informative address. There are quite a lot of questions to you, and if I may, I want to pick the top two. So first, let's discuss about the European Hydrogen Bank, as I know you are the main responsible person for the function design. So what do you think is the best expectation on the European Hydrogen Bank role or activity by 2030?
So we see the European Hydrogen Bank really as a tool that can already start to deliver offtake agreements well before 2030. If we're looking at the renewable hydrogen costs today, and we compare them with fossil-based hydrogen, then especially in Europe, it is already attractive when we had the high fossil fuel prices in place. However, of course, these investments are long-term. So what we want to make sure is that those investors that come in early, take the risk, do these long-term investments in developing new electrolyzers, still where the capex is relatively high, but they develop renewable electricity to produce that hydrogen, that we help those to find off-takers within Europe. And indeed, we're doing that by providing this green premium on top of the production costs, such that they can actually deliver competitive renewable hydrogen to the end consumers. We're doing that also because we already see end consumers in Europe being interested in shifting towards from fossil-based hydrogen to renewable hydrogen, but also we've seen some first investment decisions of, for example, steel plants that already now, well before 2030, want to convert from their blast furnaces to new technologies like direct reduction iron, just to kind of shift already now to hydrogen. So we see a task well before 2030 already for the Hydrogen Bank. Secondly, also internationally, we think there's a very important role of the European Hydrogen Bank, because of course we also need to start developing value chains. We need to have the ships, for example, in the first instance, to transport hydrogen across the globe. We might need to upgrade ammonia terminals, which we've been using for grey ammonia. We also have to start developing kind of the demand for the first conversion of gas pipelines into hydrogen pipelines. So again, we think that the European Hydrogen Bank can play an important role in these initial phases. Of course, the sooner we scale up, the lower the green premium will be, the easier it will become also for private sector investments to step in and kind of make this scale up work.
Thank you, Ms. Campena. And the second question is a little bit tricky. When will we get a direct response from the EU to the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act of the US? During your presentation, you have made a specific slides with regards to the comprehensive framework that EC is introducing. What is your perspective the most fundamental factor for a successful hydrogen market in Europe?
Yes, these are indeed two questions. And actually the first question is like about Europe responding to the US. I would actually turn this around. I think it's a very positive race here, whereby Europe already, when the COVID crisis hit the European economy, Europe stepped up and created a big fund, which we call Next Generation EU. It was the first time ever that the European Union as a whole started to borrow financing for investments in the economy. And there we made a very concrete decision that 40% of all that financing needed to go into green investments. So that's what we already did at the end of 2020. So that's what the European Union did. And I think the US, of course, tried to respond to that with the US Inflation Reduction Act. So what I think Europe is now doing is this next phase, really developing this regulatory framework and making it comprehensive. And that's important because, of course, such a development of a new hydro ecosystem will need new players. So allowing those players to come in, new kind of operators of pipelines, of terminals, of trucks, new investments into fertilizer plants, etc. That can only be done if you have a regulatory framework that is stable, that is applicable in 27 member states all at the same time, and which is forward-looking. And I think that's what we're doing now with the completion of all of these policy proposals by the end of the year.
Yes, I would also love to mention that today the European Commission also announced their plan to increase their renewable ratio to 45% by 2030. It's another big leap of the industry and also laid ground for the green hydrogen industry. Once again, I would like to thank you to Mr. Root for your excellent address. And next, please join me to welcome Mr. Damesh Jadvich, Head of Hydrogen Business Model Application Department for Energy Security and Net Zero of UK to address the UK's hydrogen economy. Ms. Damesh, the floor is now yours.
Hi, Molly. Hi, everyone. Just restarting my video. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for joining. So I'll try and keep it short today and really focus on how the UK is approaching building out the hydrogen economy, and particularly attracting and bringing through that private investment so that we can deliver projects. I have some slides as well, which I'll bring up now and talk through a couple of those. But actually, just like the speaker before me mentioned, it's a very significant week for the EU. It's a very significant week and day for the UK as well, particularly on hydrogen and carbon capture. And I'll talk about that as well briefly in my presentation. So just briefly, I'll start with some of the modeling we've done in the UK. So hydrogen needs to play a huge role in our future energy mix, particularly as we have large areas of heavy industry and power that are unlikely to be decarbonized fully through electrification. So particularly our heavy refineries in the north of the UK and different industrial clusters. And as you can see from the diagram on the right, this is our illustrative modeling back when we published the UK hydrogen strategy in 2021. There's a significant demand likely to come from industry, and I'll talk briefly about power as well, for hydrogen. And while our central priority is to electrify those sectors that can be electrified, so heating, particularly household heating, sort of regular transport, small vehicles, and other key applications, even certain industrial and manufacturing applications, we still recognize that there are areas that that are either hard to electrify, too expensive to electrify, or where the infrastructure build out requirements would be so significant, particularly grid infrastructure, that we have to prioritize hydrogen. And so, you know, here's a sort of overview diagram of what we've been thinking about for the whole wide hydrogen economy. I won't go into too much detail here. The main thing is we're thinking about initially small scale electrolytic hydrogen production, and you'll see that from the announcements we've made today. So quite localized hydrogen production, electrolyzer, local renewables or power purchase agreement straight to nearby off-takers, usually in industry or transport. But then as we progress through the mid and late 2020s, we in the UK want to start building out large-scale transport and storage networks. And that will allow us to shift from small-scale electrolytic hydrogen to large-scale CCUS and electrolytic, which can supply a range of off-takers within the region and wider. And that can include heavy transport on land, but also for shipping, for ports, as well as sort of heavy industry that I mentioned. This, we're particularly looking at pipelines across the UK, but also shipping, even as ammonia as well. And I'll then now sort of come on to some of the frameworks that we're looking at. Obviously, here's just an overview of some of the pipeline of projects that we have across the UK. There are a whole range of green and blue hydrogen projects across the UK. And actually, just this morning, we've I can add the link to the group after this call. But just this morning, we've published shortlists of projects that we'll be entering into negotiations with on the green hydrogen side. So sort of 20 projects. Some of the ones on this list have come through, and then a set of fewer projects on the carbon capture side in the Northwest cluster, as you can see on the left, HyNet, and the Northeast cluster, as you can see, sort of the projects with Tees or Tees Valley in their name. Now, just as a breezy overview before we get into the present day, we published the Hydrogen Strategy in 2021, outlining the UK's approach, updated that with the British Energy Security Strategy, doubling the capacity ambition that the UK has set. And then more recently, we've published investor roadmaps. And again, we'll be publishing another one in just the next few days. And here in the UK, we want to support all types of low carbon hydrogen production. We're ambivalent between CCUS-enabled electrolytic from renewables or potentially low temperature electrolysis or even bioenergy. And in the upcoming allocation rounds, we're exploring the technologies beyond electrolytic that could come through and really expand the capacity that we have available. What I'd say here is there's a lot going on, but just to simplify, we've got a single low carbon hydrogen standard across all the technologies, which means if you can comply with the low carbon hydrogen standard, which is the red line there, 20 grams of carbon emissions intensity, beneath that, all technologies can produce hydrogen and qualify for the subsidy support in the UK. So here, what we're basically saying is, qualify as low carbon against a single standard, and then we'll let the market dictate which technologies are the most efficient, which ones are the most cost effective, which ones can deploy at scale and supply to a range of off-takers. And then just briefly, I just want to dwell a bit on this slide before I talk about some of our announcements that we made today. So unlike different approaches, I think the previous speaker mentioned the EU Hydrogen Bank, and then you've got approaches in Germany, in Denmark, and so on. You've also got the US sort of tax credit approach to supporting and subsidizing hydrogen production. In the UK, we're taking a contractual approach, similar to the contracts for different scheme for renewable energy, for offshore wind, that some of the audience may be familiar with. And here, what we do is we award a contract to a producer, and the contract basically says, they're guaranteed to sell their the minimum price they can sell their hydrogen for is the reference price, and in this case the gas price, the natural gas price, and then they get a maximum price called the strike price, and that's negotiated with the government based on their costs and a fair rate of return. And then here's the key point: the subsidy that the producer gets for each unit of hydrogen they produce is the difference between the reference price and the strike price. Now, of course, over time, the producer will be able to sell its hydrogen above the reference price. So you see this dotted line called the achieved sales price. And of course, as that achieved sales price goes higher and higher and gets closer to the strike price, that reduces the amount of subsidy that the government has to pay out to each project. But this is how we're incentivizing private investment and how we're incentivizing projects to be built. We're basically saying if you, the project, can secure a contract from the government, which means you can demonstrate to the government that your project is deliverable, that you have the finances, that you have the management team, you have the contractors, and you have the skills and expertise to deliver, and you can deliver your project for good value for money for the government, then we will award you a contract. And then you have a fixed contract for 15 years where with the same strike price, and every unit of hydrogen you produce up to a volume cap, you will be paid a subsidy for. And we think this contractual mechanism gives investors the certainty they need to be able to invest in the UK. They know that if they secure their contract, they've got 15 years of hydrogen production in the UK, and that's a private law contract with a counterparty company of the government. It doesn't matter if the politicians change, if the government changes, if the policy changes later, that contract is fixed from the moment it starts to its 15-year end point. And just briefly, I want to talk a bit about our competitions that we're running in the UK. So on the left-hand side, we're taking a different approach to carbon capture enabled hydrogen and electrolytic or green hydrogen. So our sort of carbon capture approach is a program called the cluster sequencing process, which is essentially very large industrial clusters. We're taking a sort of whole cluster approach and supporting different carbon emitters, hydrogen producers, and carbon capture power plants on a cluster-wide basis and bringing through that support cluster by cluster. And today we announced that the shortlist for the first negotiations will be the northwest of the United Kingdom, northwest of England cluster called HyNet, and then the northeast, which is a region called Tees Valley, led by a range of companies, including BP. And then on the right-hand side, that sets out our approach to electrolytic or green hydrogen. And here we'll be running annual allocation rounds for the contracts, for the business model contracts I mentioned. We launched the first round last year, and today, just this morning, we announced the shortlist of 20 projects which will move to the next stage, negotiation, due diligence, then negotiations with the government to hopefully secure a contract. And we're looking to contract with about up to 250 megawatts in this first round, up to 750 megawatts in the second round, which will be launching later this year to deliver that sort of 1 gigawatt of electrolytic hydrogen capacity in operational construction by 2025. And then we want to run allocation rounds annually and then move to a sort of price competitive allocation or auction style allocation from 2025 onwards, but still have those repeated annual allocation rounds bringing through more and more hydrogen production capacity year after year, increasing the scale that we have running across the UK. Again, we think this contractual business model approach combined with these regular allocation rounds run in a very commercial manner, clear, objective manner, gives industry the confidence they need to invest in the UK, commit private capital and start building their projects here. And then just briefly, there's a lot of supporting policy or supporting infrastructure outside of the business model and the allocation rounds that we're delivering to support the development of the hydrogen economy. So, for example, we're looking at blending or hydrogen-ready industrial boilers and then home heating boilers. We're running village and then eventually town heating trials to test whether hydrogen heating could be effective, noting, of course, that its current high costs. And then separately, we're exploring decarbonization of very heavy transport, heavy ships, HGVs, even planes, through some of our trials and R&D funding, and updating some of our policy rules with the view that potentially this sort of very heavy transport could be a key off-taker for that hydrogen production capacity will be bringing through. And then our sort of final key pillar or key instrument are business models for transport and storage. We in the UK recognize that there is no hydrogen economy without large-scale transport, pipelines primarily, and then large-scale storage, underground salt caverns that could store large amounts of hydrogen produced using cheap renewable energy like offshore wind, stored cheaply in the salt caverns, and then released when the off-takers like transport or industry really need that hydrogen. And that gets us around the intermittency of renewables, where if the wind is not blowing, but the refinery really needs its hydrogen, then the storage, the large-scale salt cavern storage, and we're fortunate in the UK to have a number of these deposits. They can produce that and release that hydrogen for when industry needs it. And then just briefly, we've got a consultation out right now on the design of a certification scheme. This is to facilitate, eventually through the mid-2020s and later on, cross-border trade and a more fluid liquid hydrogen market. The only way this type of thing will really work, and we're really keen to work with our EU partners on this as well, EU friends, and collaborate with them, is consistent certification, so that everyone, producers, off-takers, those transporting the hydrogen, have a clear view about how that hydrogen was produced, the emissions intensity of it, and the purity, the pressure, all the key details of it, so that the hydrogen can be traded on the same basis. So we're trading the same types, the same units of hydrogen. And for us, we really believe that the certification scheme will be the key to really stimulate that cross-border trade and market growth. Again, right now we have a very small hydrogen economy, and we're looking at small projects, local projects, connecting to just local off-takers. But with a certification scheme, transport and storage, large-scale transport and storage, and then eventually off-takers like shipping, like ports, we think that could really drive the market growth and the trade needed to build out a hydrogen economy beyond just small-scale local clusters. And then just briefly, this is a whole UK-wide approach that we're looking to follow here, and so we're looking to build out projects all the way across the UK, including Northern Ireland as well, so that we can start working all the way across our jurisdiction. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now, and then come back to you, Molly, to take any questions. So that was a breezy overview, because it may be more interesting to get into the Q&A now.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Damesh. Basically, you have answered every of the questions I prepared, as you have a very extensive presentation. So now I would like to direct your attention to our open Q&A box. First, the question is from Mr. Peter Conway. Under the CFD structure, it is clear how the blue hydrogen will receive some cost mitigation, but how will the green hydrogen investment risk be mitigated? Maybe you can briefly touch on that part.
Yeah, absolutely. So the key point here about mitigating risk is about equalizing the sales price of hydrogen with the fuels that it'll be replacing. Now, clearly, hydrogen is not as simple as a contracts for difference scheme for renewable energy, because it's simply about producing those renewables and then putting that electricity into the grid. Here, hydrogen could be displacing all sorts of feedstocks or all sorts of fuels like diesel, natural gas, or even ammonia, fertilizer, different gas inputs to industrial processes. So our simplest mechanism for doing that is basically saying the green hydrogen that's produced, they are the end user, the off-taker, is guaranteed to get that for the natural gas price. So at least they don't have to pay any more for the green hydrogen than the natural gas price, and the difference is paid is covered by a subsidy from the government. The difference between the strike price, what the producer needs to be covered to recover their costs of producing that green hydrogen and make a fair return, and then still be able to sell that hydrogen to industry for a fair price. But of course, it may be in practice that people can sell their green hydrogen for different prices depending on the fuel that's being replaced. For example, if you're replacing diesel, you could sell your hydrogen for above the natural gas price if you're replacing other feedstocks that are more expensive. So over time, we might see a range of prices emerge. But hopefully that's enough of an answer for now.
Yes, Mr. Damish, as you can see, there are like 6 questions coming up all in a sudden. I'll leave this for you to address after the presentation. Just one question from my side personally. So the UK, the EU speakers have mentioned that they have a series of mechanisms to stimulate demand for low carbon hydrogen. For example, they introduce the obligation of renewable hydrogen use, and also they are implementing the the carbon border adjustment mechanism to stimulate more investment in the renewable energy or in the green hydrogen sector. So will UK follow such kind of mechanism?
Yeah, so what I'd say is, look, it's encouraging to see the EU and EU member states and the EU overall, take a slightly different approach. I think that the specifics of some of the EU member states and the EU necessitate perhaps taking a demand side approach. In the UK, we've initially started with the supply side approach. We will be subsidizing supply and then providing that confidence that the hydrogen will be produced, and basically incentivizing the hydrogen producers out there to go and chase the off-takers and bring the off-takers, stimulate that demand, and basically tell the off-takers that the hydrogen will be there, it'll be available for the natural gas price, it'll be subsidized hydrogen, and then those off-takers have the confidence that the producer will have a contract. So the off-take has the confidence to invest in the facilities needed to switch to hydrogen and enter into heads of terms, commercial agreements, and partnerships with the hydrogen producers. But of course, there are challenges to this as well. By taking a supply side approach, we're relying on the market bringing through the demand, while on the EU side, they are directly subsidizing or directly stimulating the demand, but perhaps not giving that same contractual certainty to the producers. So there are different ways of doing it. While in the US, for example, it's a supply side approach where you produce your facilities, you produce your hydrogen, and then claim your tax credits. So I think both approaches can work very well. And of course, there are always challenges bringing through new off-takers who may be hesitant, uncertain about switching to hydrogen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Damish, for your very generous sharing. We thank you so much for taking your time here. And next, we will switch our focus to the United States and explore their hydrogen dynamics. Please join me to welcome our next keynote speaker on stage, Dr. Sunita Satyabha, Director, Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office and DOE Hydrogen Program Coordinator from the U.S. Department of Energy. Dr. Sunita, I welcome you here.
Thank you so much, Molly. It's great to see all of you, and I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And after 2.5 decades in the field of hydrogen fuel cells, both in governments and industry, it's really great to see all the momentum. I think this is such a critical time here. So I'll give a really quick overview of everything that's happening in the US. And just starting with the big picture, as a reminder from the US perspective, in terms of energy consumption, you can see here, we have renewables at 13%, which for the first time in history surpassed coal. And you can see all the resources, but you can see also we rely heavily on fossil fuels in the US. So we really need to look at the entire portfolio. We have very strong administration goals. So President Biden net zero by 2050 and very ambitious interim goals, as you can see here, including a clean grid by 2035. And I also want to emphasize the priority of energy and environmental justice. So again, with the administration, very strong focus, I think, for all of us as we think about the clean energy transition. And so, for example, in the US, we have the Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of specific federal investments must benefit disadvantaged communities, so those who've experienced injustice. And so we're really spending a lot of time to look at how our investments, not just in hydrogen, but in everything, ensuring that just transition. So again, from the big picture perspective, you can see CO2 emissions in the US across the different industries. And again, this is a huge challenge in front of all of us. How do we get to those net zero goals and interim goals? And so hydrogen obviously will play a critical role across these sectors. So I think we're all seeing that in all of our countries. And what we've been doing is really looking at how do we accelerate that opportunity. So if you ask, where is hydrogen in the US today? We produce 10 million metric tons, about 10% of the global capacity. And you can see most of it for refining, ammonia production. We have about 1,600 miles of pipeline already, dedicated hydrogen pipeline, mostly in the Gulf Coast. And most of the regions have hydrogen production, mostly from natural gas. We have 3 large geological caverns, including the world's largest, so some infrastructure in place. And then this is a very rapidly moving market. So this is already out of date, but it shows you the emerging PEM electrolyzer deployments, starting very small, but now 120 megawatts, again, larger ones in the process of being announced. So a 3-fold increase in just 1 year, but still less than a gigawatt. And again, we'll be updating this very shortly. And this gives you, again, a snapshot of the end uses, where we're seeing fuel cells. And one of the major ones I always highlight is, and this is back with the Recovery Act over a decade ago. But if we go to the next slide, here again, as a reminder, we've had major legislation now. So in November 2021, the bipartisan infrastructure law, $62 billion for DOE, which is the lead agency for energy in the US. And 9.5 billion of that was hydrogen. So 1.5 billion for electrolysis, clean hydrogen manufacturing technologies, recycling. So we will be launching a recycling recovery consortium as we think about critical materials. 8 billion for at least 4 regional hubs. We have the funding opportunity out now for 7 billion out of that 8 billion for probably about 10 hubs. Again, we'll see more as that develops. A national strategy, which I'll talk about, and then of course the Inflation Reduction Act, which everyone's talking about. And we're also still in the process of issuing the guidance for that, for the tax credits. So if we go to the next slide, I will cover the national strategy. So we published a draft for public comment. So we're going through all the comments now, and we'll plan to be publishing the final, but there are really 3 main components. Target really strategic uses, so especially those hard to decarbonize sectors. And the next is reducing the cost of hydrogen, which I'll talk about, and then focus on those regional networks. So workforce development, all of that is part of the strategy. And so if we go to the next slide, I wanted to emphasize the end uses. And again, in our strategy, the goals are 10 million metric tons of clean hydrogen by 2030 and up to 50 million by 2050. And really looking again at it's not the exact numbers as shown on the left. You can see the different end use applications. But on the right, I think the main message is there's a lot of uncertainty. So the dark green shows you core scenarios across the sectors. And then the light green shows the optimistic and conservative scenarios. So I think for all of us, we see the market evolving potentially in different ways, depending on supply and use. Again, the policies in place. So it's a very complex time, and we'll continue to update it as well. And so I will continue now, I think, to the next slide and emphasize again, we have really excellent policies in place with the production tax credit, but we really need to ensure we get the cost down. So in the US, again, part of why we need such an ambitious tax credit is the cost of natural gas is really low. So if you look at US hydrogen cost, it's already $1.50 or even less. And so for us to be competitive and meet our own climate goals, we have to get the cost down to $1. So when President Biden asked our secretary, what more can we do to help accelerate hydrogen or meet our climate goals? This was the beginning of the Energy Earthshot initiative. So similar to the moonshot from over half a century ago, really launching these bold, ambitious goals. There's a handful of Earthshots, and hydrogen is one of them. And so this easily articulated goal of 111 for the US is the goal here. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to emphasize, similar to the previous speaker, it's really all hands on deck, and we're staying away from colors, so green, blue, and so forth, and it's focusing on carbon intensity and looking at all the options of how do we get the cost down. So again, various scenario analyses, depends a lot on the price of electricity, obviously in green there on the left. And if you look at basically how we think we can get down to that $1, also looking at thermal conversion, we have pyrolysis and advanced pathways, but really that can get there within a decade, but also potentially leapfrog some of the technology. So if we keep going, I have a lot to cover here. To the next slide. This is brand new. So the previous speakers before me also had exciting new announcements. So hopefully you saw the DOE commercial liftoff reports. We have a number of new Office of Clean Energy demonstrations and others. And so there are several technologies where we're looking at how do we really get to commercial liftoff. And this is preliminary, so it's posted to get feedback. But the key takeaway here is if you look at the light green circles, and for some of these applications, again, end uses, the big question is now that we have the PTC, how does that allow those sectors to start to be competitive? So the white circles show the break-even point if we didn't have the tax credits, and how for some of these applications, again, consistent with expectations with existing markets where you don't need refueling infrastructure and so forth, you can start to be competitive already today. And then you can see with the trucks, for instance, there too, the break even is reduced quite a bit. But again, there are many examples where, again, because of US market, cost of natural gas is low, alternate technology costs are low. And you can see not all of them are competitive, even with the tax credit. So with that, I think if we keep going here to the next slide, since I have a lot to cover. Here also, this is a brand new preliminary assessment of the investments that will be needed. So you can see 21 billion now, huge uncertainty again is the main takeaway, 85 to 215 billion needed across the value chain. And then The next slide is also very hot off the press information. And again, all of this will be changing. But if we go to the next slide, the big question is, especially with the tax credit, if we go to the next slide and we assume that we have quite a bit of electrolysis in the US, again, this is one estimate based on 100 gigawatts if we would need by 2030. And this shows the basically the dark colors or existing announcements of manufacturing capacity plans. So again, 4 or 5 gigawatts. But basically the takeaway message is we're going to need 20 to 25 gigawatts of electrolyzer manufacturing capacity in the US to get to our goals. And so if we keep going here, so I just want to give you a high level overview of the activities, and the next slide will summarize our current status. So again, I think the big takeaway, and I heard from the previous speakers as well, so lots and lots of announcements. This is also brand new, just published, and we'll be updating this periodically, but you can see the range. Again, we're staying away from the colors of blue and green, but many plans. And here too, the big takeaway is fortunately seeing both the production and midstream and end use application investments announced. So these are project announcements. So with that, if we keep going to the next slide, this is just a very high level takeaway in terms of all the activities within DOE. So huge investments in R&D, consortia, first of kind demonstrations, workforce analysis, deployment, and financing. And what I wanted to do is really emphasize the financing. I know, as was said, we have very high focus on the supply investments. And so financing, our loan program office on the next slide shows examples of the existing announced loan projects related to hydrogen. If we go to the next slide. And so here also very exciting. So this is again financing specifically to bridge that build that bridge to bankability. And so there are two big projects, one on pyrolysis and the other with a large energy storage project in Utah, so Nebraska and Utah. So that's $1.5 billion specifically, and you can see the job projections there. So I think for all of us as well, so really showing the concrete benefits in terms of jobs, catalyzing the market with both production and end use. So again, this is one example. And if we keep going to the next slide, there's a lot of resources available, which I think this is my last slide here. And the H2 Matchmaker website, which is open, and the plan there is to help facilitate partnerships for the hydrogen hubs, helping transparency, visibility for those who are looking for supply, looking to be a potential off-taker. Lots of resources on our website. And then if you're interested in the US program, June 5th to 8th is our annual merit review here in DC, where we showcase the hundreds of projects that we have going on in the US. And with that, I think that was my last slide.
Thank you,
Thanks
Dr. for your very extensive address. The US is certainly leading the way and harbors huge potential. During your presentation, I noticed one figure you mentioned, that is the funding gap across the midstream and end use. I believe number is $81 billion to $215 billion that are still lacking for the midstream and end use. What are the highlighted opportunities within? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about that part.
So yes, it's basically across the value chain. So if you can see, I don't know if you can go, if you want to go back to that slide, but basically production, end use, midstream infrastructure. So it's preliminary. We have quite a bit of an investment on the supply side. And so I think the big takeaway is we really can't afford to have stranded assets there. We only focus on the production. And because of the tax credit here, that is one of the major areas where we'll see significant investments. And so the end uses, we have a new joint office of energy and transportation. And we actually have a couple of billion that will be investing in infrastructure, and that will include EV charging as well as hydrogen stations. So that will also be included. So again, I think part of the takeaway is there's a big uncertainty. So 85 to 215 billion, as you can see, and that total of about 100 to 235 billion required by if we were to meet our 2030 goals.
Yes, and I also particularly like the word just transition you used during your opening remark. I believe the state's principle also wants to ensure that no one is left behind in the clean energy economy. How the DOE plans to engage the developing communities to make sure they can also participate and benefit from the hydrogen momentum?
Yeah, and this is where we have some really, I think, good examples that we're starting to implement. And one of them is a community benefits agreement. So for example, when we provide funding, so we provide grants, we also require as part of the application engagement with the communities and to show concrete benefits to those communities. We also have training, workforce development, just more and more community engagement. But there too, we're in the process of trying to establish concrete examples. So we have, for instance, trucks in a disadvantaged area, UPS delivery trucks. Looking at resiliency, again, how do we monetize and show value, air quality improvements. So I think it's a work in progress, but so far we've been getting some good feedback on that.
Yes.